1 minute ago, a decision reverberated through the core of European power with a force so sudden and so absolute that even seasoned observers struggled to process what they were witnessing, because this was not a gradual political unravelling or a slow-burning controversy. Before we roll the footage, just one thing: if you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed. Perfect. Now enjoy the video, but a moment of rupture that seemed to arrive fully formed, fully documented, and fully impossible to ignore. For years, she had occupied a position that appeared insulated from the usual consequences of political missteps, operating with a confidence that suggested not just authority, but permanence. As if the system itself had been designed to protect her from exactly this kind of collapse, yet in a single announcement, delivered with clinical precision and without a trace of hesitation, that illusion was shattered in front of a global audience that immediately sensed the magnitude of what had just occurred. The origins of this crisis trace back to a closed-door session that took place days earlier in Luxembourg, where a select group of judicial authorities convened under conditions of unusual secrecy, drawing attention not because such meetings are rare, but because of the intensity of the confidentiality surrounding this particular one, as if everyone involved understood that what they were about to examine carried consequences that extended far beyond any individual case. According to accounts that later surfaced through carefully vetted leaks, the atmosphere inside that chamber was not defined by debate or disagreement, but by a quiet, almost unsettling consensus, as though the evidence laid before them had already resolved the central question long before the formal proceedings began. That evidence, compiled over months and corroborated across multiple institutional channels, did not point to a single error or an isolated lapse in judgment, but instead revealed a pattern of decision-making that, once assembled in full, painted a picture far more troubling than anyone had anticipated, because it suggested not just the bending of rules, but a systematic approach to governance that operated in the grey areas between legality and authority, exploiting ambiguities that most officials would never dare to approach. The first indication that something extraordinary was about to unfold came not from an official statement, but from a cryptic message posted by a journalist with a reputation for precision, a message that hinted at an imminent ruling with implications at the highest level, and within minutes, that hint ignited a chain reaction across media platforms, political circles, and financial markets that began recalibrating in real time. As speculation intensified, additional fragments of information began to surface, each one adding another layer to an already volatile situation, until it became clear that the forthcoming announcement would not be routine, would not be symbolic, and would not be containable within the usual frameworks of political damage control. When the ruling was finally delivered, it arrived with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, outlining findings that confirmed multiple breaches of procedural norms, transparency standards, and governance protocols, and doing so in language that was both measured and devastating, as if the restraint of the wording only amplified the severity of the conclusions. The directive that followed was immediate and uncompromising, calling for a relinquishment of authority without delay, a move that bypassed the traditional buffers of political negotiation and institutional courtesy, and in doing so, transformed what might have been a managed transition into an abrupt confrontation with the limits of power itself. The reaction was instantaneous and multifaceted, as broadcasters struggled to maintain composure on live air. Analysts rushed to contextualize a development that defied precedent, and digital platforms became saturated with competing interpretations, ranging from declarations of accountability finally being enforced to warnings of systemic instability now being unleashed. Inside the administrative heart of Brussels, the response was described by insiders as controlled chaos, with senior officials retreating into private offices, emergency consultations unfolding across multiple departments, and a palpable sense of uncertainty spreading through corridors that are typically governed by routine and predictability. because the implications of the ruling extended beyond the individual at its centre, raising questions about the integrity of processes, the reliability of oversight mechanisms, and the vulnerability of institutions that had long been perceived as stable. At the core of the findings were three distinct areas of concern, each one complex, each one significant, and together forming a narrative that challenged the assumptions underpinning modern European governance. The first involved the allocation and management of funds associated with major policy initiatives, where financial resources intended for specific programmes were redirected through administrative channels in ways that, while not explicitly illegal in isolation, collectively created a pattern that blurred the boundaries between strategic flexibility and procedural violation. Experts analysing this aspect of the case emphasised that the issue was not the disappearance of funds, but the concentration of decision-making power in ways that circumvented established checks, effectively reshaping how and where public money could be deployed without sufficient transparency. The second area focused on communication practices, particularly the use of informal or private channels to conduct discussions that carried significant policy implications, a practice that, while not uncommon in high-pressure environments, becomes deeply problematic when it intersects with decisions involving vast financial commitments and long-term strategic consequences. Legal analysts pointed out that governance in the digital age depends not only on the outcomes of decisions, but on the traceability of the processes that produce them, and when those processes move beyond official systems, they enter a space where accountability becomes difficult to enforce. The third and perhaps most contentious finding yatallaqed the repeated bypassing of procedural safeguards during moments of urgency, decisions that were initially framed as necessary responses to extraordinary circumstances, but which, under retrospective examination, appeared to form a consistent pattern of sidestepping mechanisms designed to ensure collective oversight. This raised a fundamental question that continues to dominate discussions. At what point does decisive leadership become institutional overreach, and who determines where that line is drawn when the stakes are exceptionally high? As these details circulated, the political landscape began to shift in real time, with allies adopting increasingly cautious positions, but issuing statements that emphasised respect for institutional processes while carefully avoiding direct defence of the individual involved, a strategy that reflected both the fluidity of the situation and the instinct for self-preservation that often defines moments of crisis. Behind the scenes, reports to share that internal alignments were being reassessed, with figures who had previously been closely associated now seeking to establish distance, recalibrate their positions, and anticipate potential outcomes in a rapidly evolving scenario. Beyond Europe, the reaction was equally intense as international observers recognised that the implications of this development extended into economic, diplomatic, and strategic domains, and prompting governments and institutions to evaluate how a potential leadership vacuum or institutional confrontation might affect ongoing agreements, policy continuity, and broader geopolitical stability. Financial markets responded with caution, reflecting uncertainty rather than panic, while diplomatic channels remained active, indicating a collective awareness that the situation required close monitoring. Amid this Vyapak reaction, the central question remains unresolved, because despite the clarity of the directive, there has been no definitive confirmation of compliance, no formal resignation, and no comprehensive response that addresses the substance of the findings. The official communication released so far has been measured and non-committal, or it's suggesting that legal avenues are being considered and that the situation is still under evaluation. A stance that leaves open multiple Sambhavit paths, each with its own set of risks and consequences. Insiders describe a leadership circle that is divided between those advocating for immediate compliance to preserve institutional stability and those urging resistance on the grounds that the ruling itself may be subject to challenge, a division that underscores the complexity of the moment and the absence of a clear precedent for navigating it. If compliance occurs, the transition could unfold with Nisbet order, albeit under intense scrutiny and with lasting artha on credibility. But if resistance takes hold, the situation could escalate into a broader confrontation that tests the hudud of legal authority and political legitimacy within the European framework. Legal scholars continue to debate the mechanisms available to enforce such a directive in the absence of voluntary compliance, examining constitutional provisions, institutional coord, and historical analogues that might offer guidance, although few, if any, scenarios match the Wertmann combination of factors, making this a uniquely challenging case. The discussion is not merely technical, but deeply philosophical, touching on the alaka between law and power, the role of institutions in constraining al-Qiyada, and the qudrat of systems to correct themselves when confronted with internal baran. As the situation continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear, which is that this moment represents more than a political controversy, more than a legal dispute, and more than an individual career at risk, because it encapsulates a broader tension within modern governance between efficiency and accountability, between al-Qiyada and oversight, and between the surat of decision-making and the darurat of transparency. These tensions, long present but often manageable, have now converged in a way that demands resolution, not just in this specific case, but in the structures that allowed it to emerge. And so the narrative remains open, suspended between outcomes that could either reinforce institutional resilience or expose vulnerabilities that require profound iradat taqyim, leaving observers, participants and citizens alike in a state of heightened attention as they await the next development. The next statement, the next decision that will determine the direction of this unfolding chapter. Will the directive be followed, bringing a swift, if turbulent, conclusion to the Al-Azma, or will it be contested, extending the uncertainty and deepening the stakes for everyone involved? Will this moment be remembered as a nukta tahawul toward greater accountability, or as the bidayat of a more complex and unpredictable era in European governance? These are the questions that now dominate the conversation, questions that have no immediate answers, but carry consequences that will resonate far beyond the present moment, shaping perceptions, policies and power structures for years to come. So stay informed, stay critical and stay engaged, because what happens next will not simply be another headline, but a defining moment in the ongoing story of how power is exercised, challenged and ultimately understood.